The year was 1877, a time when the Colorado Rockies stood as nature's cathedral and executioner in equal measure. In these towering peaks where avalanches served as judge and jury, a person's worth was measured not by their words, but by their will to survive. This is the extraordinary tale of Eleanor Hayes, a woman who lost her voice to trauma but found her strength in silence, and Caleb Blackwood, a mountain recluse who had turned his back on humanity only to become one woman's salvation in her darkest. Our winter had laid its merciless hand upon the mountains, transforming the once verdant slopes into alabaster death traps. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The December air hung brittle and sharp, each breath a painful reminder of nature's indifference to human suffering. The stagecoach labored through Raven Pass, wheels crunching against snow-packed roads as the four-horse team strained against the increasing grade. Inside the swaying coach, Eleanor Hayes sat with rigid posture, her gloved hands clutched tightly around a worn leather journal in her lap. At 31, her face carried a quiet dignity, despite the hardships that had etched fine lines around her eyes. Her chestnut hair was pulled back in a practical bun, though errant strands had escaped to frame a face that rarely smiled but observed. Everything with keen intelligence. 3 years had passed since the Apache raid that had claimed her husband, her home, and her voice. The trauma of that blood-soaked day had sealed her words inside her throat, leaving her in a prison of silence. The doctors in Boston had called it hysterical mutism, a condition born of witnessing horrors too great for the mind to bear. They had prodded and examined, prescribed foul-tasting tonics, and even suggested surgical interventions, all to no avail. Eleanor's voice remained locked away, perhaps forever. "We'll be at Silverton Station by nightfall, God willing," called Jerome Pickett, the stagecoach operator, his voice carrying from his perch outside. He twisted in his seat to address the passengers through the small window. "Though this snow's getting worse by the minute." Eleanor nodded acknowledgement, her eyes meeting Pickett's briefly before returning to the journal where she wrote her responses when necessary. Beside her, Walter and Martha Cunningham, a middle-aged couple traveling to meet their son in Durango, exchanged worried glances. "Perhaps we should consider stopping at the next way station, Mr. Pickett," Walter suggested, his Boston accent marking him as an Easterner unused to mountain travel. "The weather seems quite treacherous." "Way station's closed for the season," Pickett replied, his weathered face betraying no emotion. "It's Silverton or nothing until spring." Across from Eleanor sat Reverend Thomas Abernathy, a silver-haired missionary whose rheumy eyes regarded the mountains with thinly veiled disdain. "The Lord will guide us through safely," he pronounced, though his knuckles were white where they gripped his walking stick. The final passenger, a broad-shouldered man who had introduced himself only as Miller, said nothing. His eyes, cold as the landscape outside, occasionally flickered to the small satchel tucked beneath the reverend's seat. Eleanor had noticed his attention to it several times during their journey. The stagecoach lurched suddenly as one wheel dropped into a hidden rut. Eleanor's journal slipped from her grasp, sliding across the floor to Miller's boots. He retrieved it slowly, his gaze lingering on the open page where her neat script detailed her journey west, how she had sold what remained of her property in Massachusetts to pursue a teaching position at a small school in Durango. A new beginning, far from pitying glances and whispered conversations that ceased when she entered a room. "Interesting reading," Miller commented, his voice carrying an edge that sent a chill through Eleanor. He handed the journal back, his fingers brushing against hers for a moment too long. "A woman of silence has much to observe, I imagine." Eleanor reclaimed her journal with a sharp tug, her eyes flashing warning. Miller's smile never reached his eyes. Outside, the wind began to howl with renewed vengeance, driving snow against The coach in horizontal sheets. The horses whinnied nervously, their pace slowing despite Pickett's encouraging calls. "This isn't natural," Martha Cunningham murmured, peering anxiously through the frost-rimmed window. "It's like the mountain itself is trying to keep us out." "Superstitious nonsense," Reverend Abernathy chided, though his own gaze darted nervously to the increasingly obscured path ahead. "Though I admit I've rarely seen such fury in a winter storm." The horses suddenly reared, their panicked whinnies piercing through the howling wind. The coach slewed sideways, tipping precariously as Pickett fought to regain control. "Avalanche!" came his desperate cry. "Hold fast!" The world tilted and tumbled, a chaos of splintering wood and screaming passengers. Eleanor felt herself thrown against the side of the coach, then forward as it rolled. Something hard struck her temple, and darkness crowded the edges of her vision. The last thing she remembered was the sound of snow, not the soft whisper of flakes, but the thunderous roar of a mountainside in motion, nature's white fury descending upon them with implacable force. Consciousness returned in fragments, cold seeping through layers of wool, the metallic taste of blood on her lip, the absolute silence that follows catastrophe. Eleanor's eyes fluttered open to a world transformed into a jumble of broken wood and twisted metal. The stagecoach lay on its side, half buried in snow, one entire wall torn away to expose the interior to the elements. She moved cautiously, assessing her injuries. A gash on her forehead had bled freely, but was already clotting in the cold. Her right ankle throbbed painfully when she tested it. Not broken, she thought, but badly sprained. Her fingers, numb with cold, fumbled for her journal, finding it miraculously intact in the pocket of her coat. Martha Cunningham lay sprawled nearby, her neck bent at an impossible angle, eyes staring sightlessly at the grey sky above. Walter knelt beside his wife, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs, seemingly unaware of the blood streaming from a deep cut on his cheek. The Reverend had been thrown clear of the wreckage and was struggling to extricate himself from a snowdrift, his earlier confidence replaced by panicked muttering. Of Pickett and Miller, there was no sign. Using the broken frame of the coach for support, Eleanor pulled herself upright, wincing as weight fell on her injured ankle. The wind had subsided somewhat, but snow continued to fall in thick, heavy flakes. The temperature was dropping rapidly as daylight faded. "Hello!" Walter Cunningham called desperately, his voice thin in the vast whiteness. "Mr. Pickett! Anyone?" A faint cry answered from somewhere up the slope. Eleanor squinted through the swirling snow and could just make out a figure moving toward them, Pickett, limping badly but alive. "The horses are gone," he announced as he reached them, his face grey with pain and shock, "bolted after the slide. We've got to find shelter before nightfall, or we'll freeze to death." "My Martha," Walter sobbed, still kneeling beside his wife's body. "I can't leave my Martha." Pickett's expression softened momentarily. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mr. Cunningham, but she's gone to her reward. We need to focus on the living now." Reverend Abernathy had finally freed himself from the snowdrift and was frantically searching through the wreckage. "My satchel," he kept muttering. "Where is my satchel?" "Forget your belongings," Pickett snapped. "We need to move now." Eleanor tugged at Walter's sleeve, gesturing toward the deepening gloom. Night in these mountains meant death without shelter. The grieving man allowed himself to be pulled to his feet, his movements automatic, shock evident in his vacant expression. "The way station you mentioned," Reverend Abernathy said, turning to Pickett. "How far?" 5 miles back," Pickett replied. "But in this snow, with night coming on, might as well be 50. He squinted at the surroundings, getting his bearings. "There's a mining settlement, Crow's Hollow, maybe 2 miles ahead. If we push hard, we might make it before full dark." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. Eleanor noticed something the others had not: footprints leading away from the wreckage, already being filled by fresh snow. Miller had survived and left without a word, taking the Reverend's precious satchel with him. She tugged at Pickett's sleeve and pointed to the tracks. The stagecoach driver frowned. "Miller," he spat the name like a curse. "Always figured him for the type to save his own skin. Let him go. We've got enough trouble without him." They set off toward Crow's Hollow, a pitiful procession in the gathering darkness. Eleanor struggled with each step, her injured ankle protesting beneath her weight. The cold had settled into her bones, and she could no longer feel her fingers or toes, a dangerous sign she recognized from winters in New England. Walter Cunningham moved as if in a trance, occasionally glancing back toward the diminishing shape of the stagecoach where his wife's body lay. Reverend Abernathy prayed continuously under his breath, interspersing biblical passages with complaints about the cold. Only Pickett seemed fully present, his eyes constantly scanning the terrain ahead, though his own limp grew more pronounced. With each passing minute, the light was nearly gone when disaster struck again. Pickett, leading the group along what he believed to be the trail to Crow's Hollow, stepped onto what appeared to be solid ground. There was a sickening crack as the snow-covered ice gave way beneath him. He disappeared with a startled cry, plunging through into the hidden stream below. Eleanor lunged forward, dropping to her knees at the edge of the broken ice. Pickett thrashed in the frigid water, his heavy winter clothing rapidly soaking up the deadly cold. She extended her walking stick toward him, but he was already being pulled downstream by the current, his movements growing weaker with each second. "God save us," Reverend Abernathy whispered, his earlier confidence entirely evaporated. He was our only guide. Eleanor watched helplessly as Pickett vanished around a bend in the stream, his final desperate gasp for air echoing in the gathering darkness. 3 of their party gone in the space of an hour. The mountains were claiming them one by one. Night descended with terrifying swiftness, bringing with it bone-chilling cold that cut through clothing like a knife. Without Pickett's guidance, they had no hope of finding Crow's Hollow in the darkness. Eleanor made a rapid decision. Using her walking stick, she tested the ground ahead, locating a stand of pines that offered minimal shelter from the wind. She guided the remaining survivors toward it, her determination overriding the pain in her ankle. Under the drooping branches, she cleared snow to expose the ground, then gestured for the men to help gather pine boughs for rudimentary bedding. Walter complied mechanically, while the Reverend stood uselessly by, clutching his Bible to his chest. "We're going to die out here, aren't we?" Walter said suddenly, the first clear words he'd spoken since his wife's death. "Just like Martha, just like poor Pickett." Eleanor shook her head firmly, then removed her journal from her pocket. "By the last fading light of dusk," she wrote, "we will survive until morning, then find help." But as full darkness enveloped them and the temperature plummeted further, even Eleanor's determined optimism began to falter. Without fire, without proper shelter, the bitter cold would claim them before dawn. Already she could feel the dangerous lethargy that preceded freezing to death creeping through her limbs, the tempting whisper to simply close her eyes and surrender to sleep. The Reverend had fallen silent, huddled against the trunk of the largest pine, his breathing shallow. Walter sat with his knees drawn up to his chest, staring sightlessly into the darkness. Eleanor forced herself to move, painfully clapping her hands together, stomping her feet, anything to maintain circulation and stay awake. A twig snapped somewhere in the darkness beyond their meager shelter. Eleanor froze, straining her eyes against the blackness. Another sound, the deliberate crunch of a footstep in snow. Miller returning, or something worse? She reached for a broken branch, the only weapon at hand, and positioned herself between the approaching sounds and her companions. A beam of light cut through the darkness, a lantern held high. Eleanor blinked against the sudden brightness, raising her hand to shield her eyes. The figure that materialized from the darkness was not Miller. Taller, broader, wrapped in furs rather than a city coat, with a full beard and eyes that reflected the lantern light like a predator's. A rifle was slung across his back, and a large knife hung at his belt. He surveyed the pathetic group with an expression that revealed nothing of his thoughts. "Well now," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to match the mountains themselves. "Looks like the storm's blown in some half-frozen city folk." Reverend Abernathy stirred from his stupor. "Thank the Lord," he croaked. "We've been delivered." The stranger's mouth twisted in what might have been amusement or disdain. "Lord's got nothing to do with it. Heard the avalanche. Saw the light. From the wreckage. Reckoned there might be survivors needing help." His gaze settled on Eleanor, noting the makeshift shelter she'd created. The branch she still clutched defensively. "Though seems at least one of you has some wilderness sense." Eleanor lowered her improvised weapons slowly, studying the newcomer. Despite his fearsome appearance, she sensed no immediate threat from him, and in any case, they had no choice but to trust him if they wanted to survive the night. He seemed to read her thoughts. "Name's Caleb Blackwood. Got a cabin about a mile from here. Not much, but it's warm and there's food." He glanced at Walter's vacant expression, the Reverend's trembling limbs, and Eleanor's injured ankle. "Question is, can you make it that far? Or am I burying 3 more bodies come morning?" Eleanor straightened her spine, ignoring the pain that shot through her leg, and gave a firm nod. She would make it if she had to crawl every inch of the way. Death had claimed enough victims today. She would not be among them. Blackwood held her gaze for a long moment, then inclined his head slightly, as if acknowledging her determination. "Let's move then," he said, turning to lead the way. "Storm's backing off some, but the cold's setting in hard. Follow my tracks exactly. There's treacherous ground all through here." As they set off into the darkness, Eleanor casting one last glance at their abandoned shelter, she couldn't know that this encounter would change the course of her life forever. That this silent journey through the snow was the beginning of a path that would challenge everything she believed about herself, about survival, and about finding a voice in a world determined to impose its own silence. Behind them, the wind erased their footprints, covering all evidence of their passage through the pristine snow, as if the mountains themselves were already reclaiming what they considered rightfully theirs. The journey to Caleb Blackwood's cabin tested Eleanor's limits in ways she hadn't thought possible. Each step through knee-deep snow sent lances of pain shooting through her injured ankle, yet she refused to falter. Behind her, Reverend Abernathy's labored breathing had grown increasingly ragged, while Walter Cunningham stumbled forward in a grief-stricken daze, requiring Blackwood to double back repeatedly to keep him on course. "Not much farther," Blackwood called over his shoulder, his lantern cutting a weak path through the darkness. The storm had abated somewhat, revealing glimpses of a star-filled sky between racing clouds, but the temperature continued to plummet. Eleanor could feel the air crystallizing in her lungs with each breath. She focused on Blackwood's broad back, using it as a fixed point to navigate by when her vision blurred from exhaustion. There was something reassuring about his measured stride, the confidence with which he traversed terrain that would have been treacherous even in daylight. This was a man who knew the mountains intimately, who had made peace with their dangers and learned their secrets. When Walter collapsed, for the 3rd time, Blackwood's patience finally wore thin. Without ceremony, he hoisted the smaller man over his shoulder like a sack of grain. "Your friend won't last another hour at this pace," he told Eleanor, barely breaking stride under his human burden. "Take my arm. We move faster or not at all." Eleanor hesitated only briefly before accepting his offered support. Pride had no place in survival. She grasped his forearm, feeling iron-hard muscle beneath layers of fur and wool. The Reverend wheezed behind them, clutching his Bible to his chest like a shield. "Wait," he gasped. "I cannot, please, a moment's rest." Blackwood didn't slow. "Rest means death in this cold, Reverend. Keep moving, or join your God sooner than planned." Eleanor glanced back at Abernathy's ashen face. The man was at the limit of his endurance, his lips taking on the bluish tinge that preceded frostbite. She released Blackwood's arm and moved back to the struggling clergyman, offering her own support despite her injury. Blackwood observed this with a raised eyebrow, but made no comment. Instead, he shifted Walter's weight and continued forward, adjusting his pace slightly to accommodate the slower pair. The cabin materialized out of the darkness like a mirage, a solid structure of rough-hewn logs nestled against the side of the mountain, partly sheltered by an overhanging cliff. No light shone from its single window, but a thin wisp of smoke curled from the stone chimney, promising warmth within. "Home," Blackwood announced without ceremony, setting Walter on his feet long enough to work the door latch. The interior was dark, save for the dull red glow of banked coals in a large stone fireplace. Blackwood moved with practiced efficiency in the darkness, depositing Walter on a bench near the hearth before stoking the fire back to life. As flames licked upward, illuminating the cabin's interior, Eleanor took in her surroundings with careful observation. The single room was surprisingly orderly for a mountain recluse. Dried herbs and meat hung from the rafters. Tools were arranged with military precision on a rough-hewn table. A bearskin covered a pallet bed in one corner. Shelves lined one wall, holding an unexpected collection of books, jars, and what appeared to be scientific instruments. This was not the lair of some unlettered mountain man, but the dwelling of a deliberate, educated mind. "Get those wet clothes off before you freeze in them," Blackwood directed, now feeding larger logs into the growing fire. "There are blankets in the chest. Dry yourselves while I prepare something hot." The Reverend blanched. "Sir, there is a lady present. Surely you don't expect—" "I expect you to survive the night." Blackwood cut him off. "The lady can change behind that screen." He gestured to a wooden partition in one corner. "Or she can maintain her modesty and lose fingers to frostbite. Her choice." Eleanor made her decision without hesitation, limping toward the indicated screen. Behind it, she found a small washstand and a cracked mirror that reflected her pale, exhausted face in the growing firelight. Blood had frozen in her hair where the gash on her temple had bled freely, and her lips were chapped nearly to bleeding. She looked like a woman who had already died once. Her fingers, numb with cold, struggled with the buttons of her coat and the hooks of her dress. The fine wool garments, expensive and fashionable in Boston, had proved woefully inadequate for the mountain winter. Now they hung heavy with melting snow, stealing precious body heat with every passing minute. A knock on the screen startled her. "These might serve you better," Blackwood said, his arm extending around the partition with a bundle of clothing. "My late wife's. Kept them packed away, but seems they've found purpose again." Eleanor accepted the clothes with a nod he couldn't see, surprised by this unexpected gesture. The garments were simple but practical: a wool shirt, leather trousers, thick socks knitted from rough yarn. They carried the faint scent of cedar and something else, memories perhaps, preserved in fabric. By the time she emerged, dressed in the borrowed clothes that hung loose on her slender frame, Blackwood had a pot of something bubbling over the fire. Walter sat wrapped in a blanket, staring vacantly into the flames. His grief had carved hollows into his face, aging him a decade in hours. The Reverend had reluctantly removed his outer garments but maintained his collar, a futile attempt to preserve his authority in circumstances that had stripped away all pretense. Blackwood handed Eleanor a steaming mug without comment, then served the others. The liquid was dark and bitter, Not coffee, but some herbal concoction that spread warmth through her chest as she sipped. Willow bark for pain, elderberry for strength, and a few other things, Blackwood explained, noting her questioning look. Mountain medicine, drink it all. As warmth gradually returned to their bodies, the full impact of the day's events seemed to descend upon the survivors. Walter began to weep silently, shoulders shaking with grief. The Reverend muttered prayers under his breath, his fingers compulsively working the worn leather of his Bible. Eleanor simply sat, allowing the fire's heat to penetrate her frozen core, observing their rescuer with careful attention. Blackwood moved about the cabin with the efficiency of long habit, preparing a simple meal of jerked meat and beans. His face remained largely impassive, but Eleanor caught his eyes flickering to each of them in turn, assessing their condition with clinical detachment. "You're not miners," he stated finally, breaking the silence. "Not hunters either. What brought you through Raven Pass in December?" "The Lord's work," Reverend Abernathy answered quickly. "I've been called to establish a mission in Durango." Blackwood's expression suggested what he thought of such a calling, but he merely nodded and turned to Walter. "My son," Walter said, his voice hollow. "My wife and I were traveling to join our son. He has a banking position in Durango." Fresh grief washed over his features. "Martha never wanted to leave Boston. I insisted the opportunity was too good to refuse." Eleanor felt a pang of sympathy for the man. To lose his wife and carry such guilt would be a crushing burden. Blackwood's gaze finally settled on her. "And you, silent one? What's your story?" Eleanor reached for her journal, only to remember it was still in the pocket of her sodden coat, now hanging by the fire. Blackwood, observing her dilemma, retrieved it for her. The leather was damp, but the pages inside remained mostly dry. She wrote quickly, her penmanship suffering from cold, stiffened fingers. "Eleanor Hayes, traveling to teaching position in Durango, lost voice 3 years ago after Apache attack in Arizona territory." Blackwood read her words, then met her eyes. Directly. "The mountains don't care if you can speak or not," he said. "They judge by different standards than men." There was something in his tone. Not pity, which she had grown to despise, but a simple acknowledgement of fact that resonated with Eleanor. She gave a small nod of appreciation. The Reverend, determined to reassert his authority, cleared his throat. "Mr. Blackwood, we are deeply grateful for your rescue, but I must inquire about your plans for us. How soon can we expect to reach civilization?" Blackwood turned slowly, his expression unreadable. "Civilization, Reverend? We're 3 days hard travel from the nearest town, and that's in good weather." He gestured toward the window, where snow continued to fall. "This storm's just getting started according to my knee, and my knee's never wrong about such things." "Surely, there must be neighbors, other settlers," Walter began. "Nearest neighbor's a half-mad trapper 5 miles north," Blackwood interrupted, "and he'd be more likely to skin you than help you." He took a slow sip from his mug, regarding them over. "The rim? No, you're here until the weather breaks. Could be days, could be weeks." "Weeks?" The Reverend's voice rose in alarm. "That's impossible. I have commitments, appointments." "You have survival," Blackwood corrected flatly. "Or not. Your choice." Eleanor observed the growing tension with concern. Their host clearly had little patience for complaints, yet they were entirely dependent on his goodwill. She wrote quickly in her journal and held it up for all to see. "We are alive because of your kindness, Mr. Blackwood. Please forgive our poor manners. Shock makes fools of even good men." Blackwood read her note, then surprised her with a brief, rusty chuckle. "Well said, Miss Hayes." He set down his mug and stood. "There's food in your bowls. Eat, then sleep. Tomorrow comes early and there's work if you want to keep warm and fed." He moved to the door, shrugging back into his heavy coat. "You're leaving?" Walter asked, alarm evident in his voice. "Animals need tending," Blackwood replied. "Storm or no storm?" He paused at the threshold. "Bolt the door behind me. I'll knock. 3 times when I return." With that, he stepped out into the swirling snow, leaving the 3 survivors staring after him. "Can we trust him?" the Reverend whispered once the door was secured. "A man who chooses to live alone in this wilderness must have reasons." "He saved our lives," Walter countered wearily. "What choice do we have but to trust him?" Eleanor moved to the single window, wiping frost from the glass to peer into the darkness. Blackwood's lantern bobbed like a distant star as he made his way toward what she presumed was a barn or stable. What kind of man braved such conditions to care for animals when he could have remained by the fire? Not the sort the Reverend feared, she suspected. She returned to her place by the hearth, picking up the bowl Blackwood had left for her. The stew was simple but nourishing, flavored with unfamiliar herbs. As she ate, Eleanor studied the cabin more carefully. Details emerged that she had missed in her initial assessment. A carved wooden figure of a hawk in flight, its workmanship exquisite. A small watercolor landscape hanging beside the door, the technique suggesting formal training. A shelf of books whose titles ranged from Thoreau and Emerson to medical texts and botanical studies. Their host was a puzzle, part frontier survivalist, part educated man. Eleanor found herself intrigued despite the dire circumstances. What drove someone with obvious refinement to such isolation? What sorrows or secrets had sent him into self-imposed exile? The Reverend had already claimed the single chair, his head lolling in exhaustion. Walter lay curled on the bench, grief finally giving way to the overwhelming need for sleep. Eleanor found a spot on the bearskin rug near the fire, her body surrendering to fatigue even as her mind continued to work. Softly falling snow whispered against the window panes, and the wind had shifted from threatening howl to gentle murmur. Inside the cabin, the fire popped and settled, casting dancing shadows on log walls that now represented the boundary between life and death. Eleanor's last conscious thought before sleep claimed her was that surviving the avalanche might have been just the beginning of their ordeal. The true test of endurance, of character, of humanity lay in the days ahead, trapped with a stranger whose mountains had nearly killed them once already. Outside, unseen in the darkness, a lone wolf howled, a sound that might have been lamentation or warning, and the vast Colorado wilderness continued its patient, ancient waiting. Eleanor woke to the scent of pine smoke and coffee. For a disorienting moment, she imagined herself back in her childhood home in Vermont, her father stoking the morning fire while her mother prepared breakfast. The illusion shattered as pain radiated through her swollen ankle, bringing memories of yesterday's catastrophe rushing back with cruel clarity. Pale winter light filtered through frost-covered windows, illuminating the cabin interior. Caleb Blackwood stood at the hearth, his broad back to her as he worked a cast-iron skillet over the flames. There was no sign of Walter or the Reverend. Eleanor shifted, and Blackwood turned at the sound, his movements fluid despite his size. "Your companions are seeing to the animals," he said, answering her unasked question. The younger one needed purpose to keep grief at bay. The man of God needed humbling. A hint of dry amusement touched his otherwise stern features. "The muck of a stable serves both purposes admirably." He approached, carrying a steaming mug and a small wooden box. "Your ankle needs tending," he stated, kneeling beside her. "May I?" Eleanor nodded, somewhat taken aback by the courtesy of his request. Most men, particularly doctors, had treated her body as public property since her affliction, prodding and examining without seeking permission, as if her silence had stripped away her right to dignity as well as speech. Blackwood set the mug within her reach. Willow bark tea, bitter but effective. His hands were surprisingly gentle as he examined her ankle, probing the swollen flesh with practiced fingers. "Not broken. Bad sprain. You're fortunate." Eleanor raised an eyebrow skeptically. "Fortunate?" seemed a strange description of her circumstances. Blackwood caught her expression, and the corner of his mouth twitched. Alive, with all limbs intact after an avalanche? Yes, Miss Hayes, that's fortune by mountain standards. From the wooden box, he removed a jar of salve that filled the air with the sharp scent of camphor and something resinous. My own mixture, he explained as he began to apply it to her ankle. Pine resin, arnica, comfrey root, reduces swelling, eases pain. The salve tingled against her skin, at first uncomfortable, then oddly soothing as the herbal compounds began their work. Blackwood's hands moved with the confidence of long practice, wrapping her ankle firmly but not too tightly in a clean strip. Of linen. You have medical training, Eleanor wrote in her journal, showing him the words when he finished. Blackwood read her note, his expression closing slightly. I've had cause to learn many things. He stood abruptly, returning to the hearth. Without elaboration, Eleanor sipped the bitter tea, observing him over the rim of her mug. The daylight revealed details of his appearance that had been obscured in the night. His dark beard was neatly trimmed, not wild as one might expect of a mountain hermit. Deep lines bracketed his mouth and eyes, speaking of hardship rather than age. She guessed him to be perhaps 40, though the frontier aged men quickly. A puckered scar ran from his right temple into his hairline, disappearing beneath thick hair that showed premature strands of silver. Most striking were his eyes, pale grey like winter ice, watchful and intelligent. They carried shadows of experiences Eleanor could only guess at, along with a wariness that suggested trusting didn't come easily to him. The door swung open, admitting a blast of cold air along with the Reverend and Walter. Both men stamped snow from their boots, their faces reddened by the frigid temperature. The Reverend looked particularly aggrieved, his clerical dignity clearly offended by the manual labor he'd been assigned. A man could freeze solid just crossing. The yard, he complained, making directly for the fire, and those creatures are most uncooperative. Animals sense fear and insincerity, Reverend, Blackwood replied, ladling a thick porridge into wooden bowls. Approach with respect, they'll respond in kind. Walter accepted his bowl with murmured thanks, his face haggard from grief and poor sleep. The storm's grown worse, he reported quietly. Can't see more than 10 feet in any direction. Blackwood nodded. It'll be 3 days at least before the pass is navigable. We'll need to stretch supplies and labor accordingly. He turned. To Eleanor, your ankle needs rest today. Tomorrow we'll see if you can move about with a walking stick. The Reverend bristled at Blackwood's natural assumption of leadership. Mr. Blackwood, while we appreciate your hospitality, we cannot simply become your servants. I have important church business awaiting me in Durango. Your church business won't matter if you're dead, Reverend, Blackwood replied evenly. Everyone works, everyone eats, mountain law. Eleanor watched the clash of wills with interest. Reverend Abernathy was accustomed to deference by virtue of his collar. Blackwood clearly measured men by different standards. She suspected the mountain man's patience with the clergyman's pretensions was already wearing dangerously thin. To diffuse the tension, she wrote quickly in her journal and held it up. What tasks can I complete while resting my ankle? Blackwood read her note and considered for a moment. The hide on the north wall needs scraping and curing. There are knives in the drawer beneath it, and the curing mixture is in the blue jar on the shelf. I'd consider it fair trade for your lodging. Eleanor nodded, relieved to have purposeful work. In truth, she'd never prepared a hide in her life. Her education at Miss Porter's School for Young Ladies had focused on watercolors and French conversation, not frontier survival skills. But she was observant and willing to learn. The day established a pattern that would govern the survivor's existence in the coming days. Blackwood assigned tasks according to ability, brooked no complaints, and worked alongside them without comment. The Reverend was relegated to chopping firewood, a task that quickly humbled his soft hands and city-bred muscles. Walter, desperate for distraction from his grief, threw himself into whatever work Blackwood assigned, from clearing snow from the cabin roof to repairing damaged tools. Eleanor applied herself to the hide with determined concentration. The work was difficult and malodorous, but there was satisfaction in the rhythmic scraping, the gradual transformation of raw skin to usable leather under her hands. She found herself appreciating the straightforward nature of the task, so different from the artificial busywork that had occupied her days in Boston, the endless rounds of appropriately feminine handicrafts and social calls that filled time, but served no essential purpose. Blackwood checked her progress occasionally, offering terse corrections to her technique, but no praise. Eleanor found she preferred his frank assessment to the condescending compliments she'd grown accustomed to receiving for even the most mediocre accomplishments. There was a refreshing honesty to his manner, an assumption that she would rise to challenges rather than require coddling. By late afternoon, the cabin had settled into an unexpected domesticity. The Reverend dozed in the chair, exhausted by unaccustomed physical labor. Walter mended a pair of snowshoes under Blackwood's direction, his hands finding comfort in the repetitive weaving. Eleanor, having completed the initial scraping of the hide, had graduated to preparing vegetables for the evening meal, wielding a knife with increasing confidence. Outside, the storm continued unabated, snow piling in drifts against the cabin walls, wind moaning through the chimney like a restless spirit. The wilderness seemed determined to remind them of its power, of their fundamental vulnerability despite the shelter's sturdy walls. "Will your family be concerned by your absence, Miss Hayes?" Walter asked suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. "With the stage lost, no word will reach Durango of our delay." Eleanor shook her head, then wrote in her journal, "No family remains, parents deceased, no siblings." "A woman alone in the world," the Reverend murmured, rousing from his nap. "A most unfortunate circumstance." Eleanor stiffened at his tone, the familiar mixture of pity and subtle disapproval she'd encountered so often since her husband's death. As if widowhood and silence had rendered her somehow less than complete, an object of charity rather than a person deserving respect. "Seems to me Miss Hayes has managed well enough," Blackwood observed, looking up from his work. "Takes courage to travel west alone." The simple statement, delivered without particular emphasis, nonetheless warmed Eleanor. It was perhaps the first time since her affliction that someone had acknowledged her strength rather than her limitations. The Reverend was not so easily silenced. "A woman's proper place is under the protection of father or husband, Mr. Blackwood. Miss Hayes's situation, while not of her making, is nonetheless contrary to God's design." Eleanor's knife paused above the potato she was peeling. She'd heard this sermon before, from doctors, from her late husband's family, from well-meaning church ladies who thought her recovery depended on accepting her natural dependence. Her silence had seemingly granted permission for others to speak for her, to prescribe her proper path as if she had no will of her own. To her surprise, it was Walter who responded. "My Martha managed our household accounts, corresponded with business associates, and raised our son to manhood during my frequent absences," he said quietly. "She had more practical wisdom in her little finger than most men possess in their entire beings. I never once thought her less capable for being female." The Reverend frowned, clearly displeased at having his authority challenged by a layman. "Individual exceptions do not negate divine order, Mr. Cunningham." "Divine order seems a convenient argument when it maintains men's advantage," Blackwood commented, his tone deceptively mild as he tested the edge of a freshly sharpened axe blade. With his thumb, color rose in the Reverend's face. "You propose to lecture me on theology, sir?" A man who has clearly turned his back on civilized society? Not at all, Reverend, Blackwood replied. Merely observing that I've known many women with more natural courage and sense than men who quote scripture to justify their own importance. He rose, setting the axe aside. Now, if you'll excuse the interruption to your sermon, there are animals that need tending before nightfall. The Reverend spluttered indignantly as Blackwood donned his coat and exited the cabin, but Eleanor found herself fighting an inappropriate urge to smile. There was something refreshing about the mountain man's blunt assessment, so different from the careful social dance of Eastern society. Walter resumed his work on the snowshoes, seemingly oblivious to the tension, but Eleanor noticed a certain lightness in his movements that had been absent before. Perhaps, like her, he found some relief in Blackwood's pragmatic worldview, in the focus on immediate survival rather than abstract social codes. When Blackwood returned an hour later, his beard rimed with frost, he carried an unexpected bounty, a wild turkey, its feathers still warm. Fool Bird was sheltering in the pine grove behind the stable, he explained, laying it on the table. Miss Hayes, I assume you know how to dress poultry? Eleanor nodded. Though raised in comfort, she'd spent summers on her grandfather's Vermont farm, and was no stranger to the practical aspects of preparing food from its original form. She set aside the vegetable knife and selected a sharper blade from Blackwood's collection, gesturing for him to bring the bird closer to the fire where the light was better. Reverend, more wood for the fire, Blackwood directed. Walter, fetch water from the rain barrel. The Reverend opened his mouth as if to protest the command, then apparently thought better of it when he met Blackwood's level gaze. He shuffled to the woodpile with poor grace, muttering under his breath. Eleanor worked efficiently, plucking and cleaning the turkey with practiced movements. There was satisfaction in the task, in knowing her skills contributed meaningfully to their collective survival. For the first time since the accident, she felt truly useful rather than merely accommodated. Blackwood worked nearby, preparing a marinade of wild herbs and berries preserved in vinegar. Occasionally, their hands would brush as they moved about the small preparation area, and Eleanor found herself unusually aware of his proximity. There was something compelling about his self-contained competence, his lack of awkwardness around her, despite, or perhaps because of, her silence. You've done this before, he observed, watching her separate the giblets with deft precision. Eleanor nodded, then impulsively wrote in her journal, Vermont Farm Summers. Grandfather believed idle hands invited mischief. A ghost of a smile touched Blackwood's lips. Wise man, your grandfather. The small exchange felt strangely intimate amid the mundane work of food preparation. Eleanor realized with some surprise that it had been years since someone had spoken to her so naturally, without the strained politeness or exaggerated enunciation that had become her daily experience. Blackwood addressed her as a capable equal, neither ignoring her disability nor defining her by it. The turkey, roasted over the open flame and seasoned with Blackwood's wilderness herbs, proved the most satisfying meal any of them had enjoyed since the accident. Even the Reverend grudgingly complimented the flavor, though he attributed it to God's bounty rather than their host's skill or Eleanor's preparation. As they ate, the wind rose to a shrieking howl, rattling the cabin's shutters and driving snow through the smallest cracks in the chinking between logs. The temperature in the room dropped perceptibly, despite the fire's warmth. Worst storm in 3 winters, Blackwood commented, rising to add another log to the flames. We're fortunate to have solid walls between us and it. Walter shuddered visibly. If you hadn't found us— But he did find us, the Reverend interjected firmly, guided by Providence to our aid in our hour of need. Blackwood's expression suggested he credited his rescue to more practical factors than divine intervention, but he merely nodded. Regardless, we'll be sharing quarters for longer than anticipated if this weather holds. which means we need to establish some order." He surveyed the small cabin. "Walter and the Reverend can take the sleeping platform. I'll use my bedroll near the door. Miss Hayes can have the bearskin by the fire, warmest spot, and offers some privacy." Eleanor appreciated his consideration. The arrangement would allow her the dignity of separate sleeping space while acknowledging her injured ankle's need for warmth. "Your charity honors you, Mr. Blackwood," the Reverend said, with the air of bestowing approval. "Not charity, Reverend, practicality. Miss Hayes is injured and smaller than any of us. She needs less space and more warmth." Blackwood's tone made it clear he sought no praise for basic human decency. As they prepared for sleep, banking the fire and arranging their meager belongings, Eleanor found herself reflecting on the strange turns of fortune that had brought her to this place. 24 hours ago, she had been a respectable Eastern lady traveling west to begin a new chapter in her carefully planned life. Now she was a survivor in a mountain cabin, dependent on the skills and goodwill of a stranger who lived by codes foreign to her previous existence. Stranger still was the realization that despite the danger, despite the pain and uncertainty, she felt more genuinely alive than she had in the 3 years since losing her voice. Here, her silence was simply one facet of her being, not the defining feature that others fixated upon. Here, her contributions were valued according to their utility, not judged against artificial standards of feminine propriety. As darkness claimed the cabin and the others fell into exhausted sleep, Eleanor remained awake, listening to the storm's fury. In its elemental power, she recognized something kindred to the emotions she had suppressed for so long. Grief, rage, fear, all the feelings proper Boston society had insisted she contain behind a mask of serene acceptance. Perhaps, she thought, as sleep finally began to claim her, the true wilderness was not the Colorado mountains, but the suffocating constraints of civilization she had left behind. Perhaps in this harsh land she might find not just survival, but a kind of freedom she had never thought to seek. Outside, the storm raged on, reshaping the landscape with indifferent power. Inside, something equally profound was beginning to shift within Eleanor Hayes. Not a voice regained, but perhaps a self rediscovered, tempered in the crucible of survival and strengthened by the simple dignity of necessary work. She drifted into sleep with the unexpected realization that for the first time since the Apache raid that had claimed her husband and her voice, she was not dreaming of the past or fearing the future, but fully present in the moment. Whatever tomorrow might bring, be it salvation or further hardship, she would face it with newfound clarity and purpose. The mountain had nearly killed her, but in doing so, it had awakened something long dormant. The will not merely to survive, but to truly live on her own terms, silent or not. 7 days into their confinement, the storm finally broke. Morning arrived with startling clarity, sunlight blazing across pristine snow with diamond brilliance. The temperature remained bitterly cold, but the howling wind had subsided to occasional whispers, and the endless snowfall had ceased. Eleanor stood in the doorway of the cabin, leaning on the walking stick Blackwood had carved for her from a length of hickory. The landscape before her bore little resemblance to the terrain they had traversed during their desperate flight from the avalanche. What had been a rugged mountainside with distinctive features was now a smoothly sculpted expanse of white, treacherous, in its beautiful uniformity. "Don't be fooled by the sunshine," Blackwood said, joining her at the threshold. "Snow that deep hides deadfalls, creeks, all manner of dangers. And it'll be 2 days at least before it crusts enough to bear weight." Eleanor nodded, understanding the implication. Despite the improved weather, they remained as effectively trapped as they had been during the storm's fury. Behind them, the Reverend's voice rose in morning prayer, a ritual he had insisted upon establishing, despite Blackwood's obvious indifference. Walter joined him dutifully, though Eleanor had noticed his participation growing increasingly perfunctory as days passed. The veneer of civilization was wearing thin under the pressures of survival, revealing the true natures beneath social masks. "Your ankle's improved," Blackwood observed, nodding toward her injured limb, bearing weight now without much pain. Eleanor shifted experimentally, testing the joint, then gave a small nod of confirmation. The swelling had subsided considerably under Blackwood's herbal ministrations, and while not fully healed, her ankle no longer throbbed with every heartbeat. The walking stick provided enough support to allow her mobility around the cabin and immediate yard, a freedom she treasured after days of restricted movement. "Good," Blackwood said. "We'll need to check the trapline today. Animals will be moving after the storm, hungry enough to risk the bait." He glanced back at the men inside. The Reverend's hands are too soft for delicate work, and Walter still loses focus too easily. "You able to handle it?" Eleanor considered the question seriously. Checking traps likely meant trudging through deep snow for some distance, possibly handling dead animals, certainly enduring intense cold. Yet the prospect of meaningful activity, of fresh air and purpose after the cabin's close confines, held undeniable appeal. She wrote quickly in her journal, "I can manage. Show me what to do." A hint of approval flickered in Blackwood's eyes. "Dress. Warm," he instructed. "We leave in 20 minutes. Bring your journal. You'll want to note the locations." Inside, the Reverend predictably objected to the plan. "Miss Hayes is not suited for such rough labor, Mr. Blackwood. Surely Walter or I—" "Miss Hayes has 2 sound hands and a keen eye," Blackwood cut him off. "The traps need checking by someone who won't destroy a week's worth of careful setting. Through clumsiness or inattention." He raised an eyebrow at Eleanor. "Unless you object to the work?" Eleanor shook her head firmly, suppressing a flicker of amusement at the Reverend's affronted expression. She had discovered over the past week that nothing irritated Abernathy more than her willingness to engage in tasks he deemed unsuitable for feminine hands. His concept of womanhood seemed to consist primarily of limitations, things ladies must not do, could not understand, should not attempt. Blackwood, by contrast, appeared to measure capability without regard to gender. He assigned tasks based on aptitude rather than convention, an approach Eleanor found surprisingly liberating. Under his matter-of-fact instruction, she had learned to split kindling, repair snowshoes, and prepare game, practical skills her privileged upbringing had never included. 20 minutes later, bundled in layers of wool and fur, Eleanor followed. Blackwood out into the dazzling morning. The snow reached midway up her thighs, making each step an effort despite the path Blackwood broke before her. Her breath clouded in the frigid air, and the intense cold made her eyes water, freezing tiny droplets on her eyelashes. Yet there was exhilaration in the outing that overshadowed its discomforts. After a week confined within log walls, the vast expanse of the mountainside filled her with unexpected joy. The world stretched away in all directions, peaks rising like white islands from a frozen sea, valleys dropping into hazy blue shadows where forests stood cloaked in winter splendor. They moved at a deliberate pace, Blackwood occasionally pointing. Out landmarks visible above the snow's crust, a distinctive boulder, a lightning-struck pine, a cliff face that caught the morning sun. "Navigation's half of survival," he explained. "Get lost in these mountains. Everything else you know becomes worthless." Eleanor noted each marker carefully in her journal, creating a map she could reference if needed. Though she had no immediate plans to traverse the wilderness alone, the knowledge gave her a sense of capability, of potential independence that had been stripped from her by well-meaning protectors since her affliction. The first trap yielded nothing, though Blackwood pointed out tracks nearby that indicated a rabbit had investigated the bait but not triggered the mechanism. The second and third were similarly empty, causing Blackwood's brow to furrow with concern. "Supplies won't stretch forever," he murmured, more to himself than to Eleanor. Need fresh meat soon." They approached the fourth trap, set in a small clearing below a rocky outcrop. From 10 paces away, Eleanor could see that this one had been successful, and recently. A large hare lay caught in the simple snare, its white winter coat stained red where the wire had tightened. More concerning were the fresh tracks surrounding it, much larger than the rabbit's, with distinct claw marks visible even to Eleanor's untrained eye. Blackwood froze, his hand moving slowly to the rifle slung across his back. "Mountain lion," he said quietly. "Fresh sign." It smelled the blood. Eleanor's pulse quickened. She had heard stories of the big predators, powerful, stealthy, hunters capable of taking down prey much larger than a human. Her eyes darted to the surrounding trees and rocks, suddenly seeing potential hiding places in every shadow. "Stay close," Blackwood instructed, unslintering his rifle with careful movements. "We'll retrieve the hare quickly and return to the cabin." No sudden movements. They approached the trap cautiously. Blackwood knelt to free the dead hare from the snare, his movements efficient but unhurried. Eleanor stood guard, scanning their surroundings as he had taught her earlier that week, looking for shapes that didn't belong, for the telltale twitch of a tufted tail, for the gold-green gleam of predator eyes. The attack came without warning, from an unexpected direction. Not from the rocks above or the trees around them, but from behind, where they had already passed and deemed safe. The mountain lion cleared the distance in a single powerful bound, a tawny blur against the white snow, its target not Blackwood, but Eleanor, perhaps assessing her as the weaker prey. She had no time to write a warning, no voice to scream an alert. Acting on pure instinct, Eleanor swung her walking stick in a wide arc, the heavy hickory connecting solidly with the big cat's shoulder, disrupting its leap just enough that its claws raked her arm rather than her throat. Pain lanced through her as fabric tore and skin split beneath the razor-sharp claws. She staggered backward, raising the stick for another defensive blow, but Blackwood was already moving. He drove the butt of his rifle into the mountain lion's ribs with devastating force, then pivoted to place himself between Eleanor and the momentarily stunned predator. The big cat recovered quickly, muscles bunching for another attack, lips pulled back from yellowed fangs in a silent snarl. Blood stained the snow where Eleanor's walking stick had connected, but the injury only seemed to have enraged the animal rather than deterred it. "Back away slowly," Blackwood directed, his voice deadly calm. "I won't have a clean shot with you. Behind me." Eleanor did as instructed, cradling her injured arm against her chest, feeling warm blood soaking through layers of clothing. The pain was intense, but oddly distant, pushed aside by the more immediate imperative of survival. The mountain. Lion's tail lashed from side to side, its attention now fully on Blackwood, recognizing him as the more dangerous adversary. Man and beast measured each other in a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity. Primitive intelligences calculating odds and opportunities with cold precision. When the cat sprang again, Blackwood was ready. The rifle's report echoed off the mountainside, a thunderous crack that sent birds exploding from nearby trees. The mountain lion dropped mid-leap, momentum carrying its lifeless body forward to land at Blackwood's feet, a blooming red stain spreading across its chest where the bullet had found its heart. For a heartbeat, silence reigned. Then Blackwood turned to Eleanor, his expression shifting from deadly focus to concern as he took in her bloodied sleeve. "How bad?" he asked tersely, slinging his rifle and moving to her side. Eleanor shook her head, uncertain herself of the injury's severity. The adrenaline of the attack was beginning to ebb, allowing pain to flow back in redoubled intensity. She swayed slightly, lightheaded from shock and blood loss. Blackwood caught her arm gently, pushing back the torn fabric to expose 3 deep gashes across her forearm. "Clean cuts," he assessed. "Missed the main vessels or you'd be unconscious already. Need to bind it quickly." He worked with practiced efficiency, tearing strips from his own undershirt to create a pressure bandage. The improvised dressing turned red almost immediately, but the bleeding slowed under the tight binding. "Can you walk?" Blackwood asked, his voice gentler than she had ever heard it. "Cabin's a half-mile back." Eleanor nodded, though the prospect of retracing their steps through deep snow with an injured arm seemed suddenly daunting. She was startled when Blackwood moved behind her and placed his hands at her waist. "I'm going to lift you onto my back," he explained. "It's not propriety, it's practicality. You've lost blood, temperature's dropping, and we need to move fast." There was no room for false modesty in survival. Eleanor allowed him to hoist her onto his back, her good arm wrapping around his neck for stability. The position was awkward, but secure, and she found herself grateful for his strength as he began the trudge back toward the cabin, carrying both her weight and the mountain lion's carcass slung across his shoulders. The return journey passed in a haze of pain and cold. Eleanor fought to remain conscious, focusing on the steady rhythm of Blackwood's breathing, the crunch of his boots breaking through snow crust, the occasional murmured encouragement he offered when he felt her grip slacken. "Stay with me, Eleanor," he said, using her given name for the first time. "Cabin's just ahead. See the smoke?" She forced her eyes open, blinking against dizziness to follow his gaze. Indeed, the thin column of wood smoke was visible rising beyond the next ridge, a beacon of safety in the wilderness. The sight gave her renewed determination to remain conscious, to not become a dead weight on this man who had already saved her life twice over. Their arrival at the cabin caused immediate commotion. The Reverend exclaimed in horror at Eleanor's bloodied appearance, while Walter helped Blackwood lower her gently onto the bearskin rug near the fire. "Boil water," Blackwood ordered, already cutting away the makeshift bandage to better assess the wounds. "And bring my medicine chest from beneath the bed." The claw marks were ugly, but not life-threatening. Blackwood cleaned them meticulously, with boiled water and a solution that smelled strongly of alcohol, causing Eleanor to bite her lip against waves of stinging pain. He worked with the focused concentration of a physician, his hands surprisingly gentle given their size and strength. "You'll need stitches," he told her, meeting her eyes directly. "I've done this before, but it will hurt. Do you trust me to do it?" Eleanor considered the alternative, allowing the wounds to heal without sutures, risking infection or improper mending that might limit the use of her arm permanently. She gave a firm nod, then reached for her journal with her good hand. "You've sewn up worse, I imagine," she wrote, a flicker of something. Memory, regret, passed across Blackwood's face. "Yes," he said simply. "I have." The Reverend hovered anxiously as Blackwood threaded a curved needle with what appeared to be fine silk thread. "Surely we should wait," he protested. "When we reach civilization, a proper doctor—" "Infection won't wait for civilization, Reverend," Blackwood cut him off, "and Miss Hayes has already decided." He glanced at Walter. "Hold her arm steady. This needs to be done right the first time." Eleanor braced herself as Walter gently but firmly secured her forearm. The first pierce of the needle sent a shock of pain radiating up to her shoulder, causing her to inhale sharply through her teeth. Blackwood worked quickly but with extreme care, his focus absolute as he drew the edges of torn flesh together with neat, precise stitches. "You're doing well," he murmured as he tied off the third stitch. Most men would have fainted by now. Eleanor managed a tight smile despite the pain. There was something in his tone, not condescension but genuine respect for her endurance. She fixed her gaze on his hands, watching the strange intimacy of needle and thread moving through her flesh, binding together what had been violently separated. By the 10th stitch, a curious calm had descended upon her. The pain remained intense but somehow separate, as if happening to someone else. She found herself studying Blackwood's face as he worked, the concentration in his eyes, the slight furrow between his brows, the set of his mouth. This was a man accustomed to mending what was broken, to restoring function where damage had occurred. There was art in his practicality, beauty in his utilitarian skill. When the final stitch was placed and the wounds dressed in clean bandages smeared with herbal salve, Eleanor felt oddly transformed. The mountain had marked her permanently, but she had survived its challenge. The scars would remain, but they would be badges of endurance rather than disfigurements to hide. "You should rest," Blackwood advised, washing blood from his hands in a basin of warm water. "Your body needs time to recover from the shock." Eleanor nodded, suddenly aware of the bone-deep exhaustion that had settled into her limbs. Yet before surrendering to sleep, she needed to express something too complex for her journal's written words. She reached out with her good hand, catching Blackwood's wrist in a gentle grip. When he turned to her, she met his gaze steadily and formed the words silently with her lips. "Thank you." Understanding crossed his features. "You saved yourself first," he said quietly. "That walking stick bought the seconds I needed to act. Remember that." It was perhaps the greatest gift he could have offered, not absolution or protection, but acknowledgement of her own agency in her survival. Eleanor closed her eyes, allowing exhaustion to claim her, and slipped into dreamless sleep beside the fire. She woke hours later to hushed voices. Night had fallen, and the cabin was illuminated only by firelight. Blackwood and Walter sat at the table, their heads bent close together in serious conversation. The Reverend was nowhere to be seen. "Far more dangerous than I initially believed," Blackwood was saying, his voice pitched low. "If Miller was indeed searching for it, others will follow." "But surely after the avalanche they would assume it lost," Walter replied, sounding troubled. "No one could know we survived. Men driven by such greed rarely abandon pursuit easily," Blackwood countered, "especially when the stakes are this high." Eleanor shifted slightly, drawing their attention. Walter started guiltily, but Blackwood's expression remained calm as he rose to check on her condition. "Fever?" he asked, placing a cool hand on her forehead. "Pain?" She shook her head to both questions, then reached for her journal. Curiosity overriding her discomfort. "What danger are you discussing?" The two men exchanged glances, some silent communication passing between them. Finally, Blackwood sighed and retrieved a small leather pouch from his pocket. He loosened the drawstring and tipped the contents into his palm, 6 rough stones that gleamed dully in the firelight. "Diamonds," he said simply, "uncut but genuine. Found in Reverend Abernathy's Bible while treating your arm, hidden in a hollowed-out section." Eleanor stared at the stones, understanding dawning, the Reverend's precious satchel, his distress. When it disappeared, Miller's consistent attention to it throughout their journey suddenly all made terrible sense. "The Reverend is a smuggler?" she wrote, disbelieving despite the evidence before her eyes. "Worse," Walter said grimly, "we think he's a murderer." The word hung in the air like gunsmoke. Murderer. Eleanor stared at Walter, her mind struggling to reconcile the self-righteous but seemingly harmless Reverend with such darkness. "How can you be sure?" she wrote, her normally neat script made jagged by her injured arm. Blackwood's expression hardened. "While you slept," Walter recalled something. "Tell her." Walter leaned forward, his grief-lined face solemn in the firelight. "On our second day of travel, before the avalanche, I overheard Miller and the Reverend arguing in hushed tones behind the stagecoach while Pickett changed a wheel. Miller said something about blood on these stones and the missionary in Denver. The Reverend told him to keep his voice down, that God's work required sacrifices." He shook his head. "I thought nothing of it at the time. Assumed they were discussing mission funding or some theological matter. There was a murder in Denver 3 weeks ago," Blackwood added. "News traveled even to these mountains. A missionary and his wife killed in their home, their church's diamond mine funds. Missing, the Reverend claimed to be their replacement. Eleanor felt cold despite the fire's warmth. "Where is he now?" "Checking snares with my rifle," Blackwood replied, his tone making it clear how little he trusted the man with his weapon. "I sent him out to give us time to talk. He doesn't know we've found the diamonds." The cabin door opened at that moment, admitting a blast of cold air and the Reverend himself. Snow dusted his shoulders, and his cheeks were flushed with cold. He carried Blackwood's rifle in one hand and a single rabbit in the other, a meager return for several hours' effort. "The Lord has provided us with sustenance, albeit modest," he announced, hanging the rabbit on a hook by the door. His eyes narrowed slightly as he took in their huddled conference, Eleanor's awakened state, and the sudden silence that had fallen. "I trust our patient is improved?" "Miss Hayes will recover," Blackwood said neutrally, subtly shifting his body to block the Reverend's view of the diamonds, which he had swiftly returned to their pouch. "The mountain lion's claws missed anything vital." "Divine providence," the Reverend declared, setting the rifle aside with obvious relief. He had never been comfortable with the weapon, handling it with the awkward distaste of a man unused to such tools. "Though I must say, Mr. Blackwood, your snares are placed in most inhospitable locations. Surely there are more accessible places. For trapping, game goes where it will, not where men find convenient," Blackwood replied. He rose, ostensibly to check Eleanor's bandages, but his position now placed him between the Reverend and the others, his back to the wall where he could observe everyone in the cabin. "Did you reset the traps as I showed you?" The Reverend waved dismissively. "I saw little point. Such primitive sustenance will soon be unnecessary. I've been considering our situation, and I believe we should attempt to reach Durango tomorrow. The weather has cleared, and my mission cannot be delayed further." The audacity of the suggestion that they should embark on a treacherous mountain journey without preparation or adequate supplies would have been merely foolish from anyone else. Coming from a man they now suspected of murder, it carried more sinister implications. "The snow's still too deep," Blackwood said evenly. "No crust formed yet to support weight. You'd exhaust yourself within a mile, Reverend." "Perhaps for an ordinary traveler," Abernathy conceded with false humility, "but one empowered by divine purpose finds strength beyond normal human limits. And I've observed you possess snowshoes that would facilitate our journey." "3 pairs for 4 people," Blackwood pointed out, "and Miss Hayes is in no condition to travel with that arm." The Reverend's gaze flickered to Eleanor, assessing. "The young lady has demonstrated remarkable fortitude. Surely she would not wish to delay our return to civilization and proper medical care." He directed this last to Eleanor, his tone solicitous, but his eyes calculating. Eleanor met his gaze steadily, then reached for her journal. "The stitches are well placed. I prefer to allow proper healing before risking further injury." Something ugly flashed briefly across the Reverend's features before his pastoral mask slipped back into place. "Of course, my dear. We must all bow to our physical limitations, however inconvenient to greater purposes." The undercurrent of tension in the cabin was palpable now. Walter fidgeted nervously with a piece of kindling, avoiding direct eye contact with the Reverend. Blackwood remained outwardly calm, but Eleanor noticed his weight had shifted slightly onto the balls of his feet, the stance of a man prepared for sudden movement. "I should see to the mountain lion carcass," Blackwood said after a moment. "Meat needs proper dressing before it spoils." He glanced at Walter. "Could use your help with the heavier work." Walter nodded quickly, understanding the unspoken strategy. They couldn't leave Eleanor alone with the Reverend, not now. "I'll stay with Miss Hayes," the Reverend offered smoothly. "She shouldn't be left unattended in her condition." "Actually," Eleanor wrote quickly, "I need fresh air. My head aches from lying too long indoors." She managed to stand, swaying slightly, but determined. The Reverend's smile thinned. "Surely the cold would be detrimental to your recovery." Mountain air promotes healing, Blackwood countered, and the lion needs to be skinned away from the cabin. Blood attracts predators. He helped Eleanor don her coat, supporting her with a steady hand. We all go. Outside, the late afternoon, sun cast long blue shadows across the snow. The mountain lion's carcass lay on a wooden platform behind the cabin, its powerful body stiff with cold. Despite the circumstances, Eleanor couldn't help but admire the creature's beauty, the tawny fur, the perfect symmetry of lethal muscle and bone. In death, it projected the same dangerous majesty it had possessed in life. Blackwood worked methodically, his knife separating skin from flesh with practiced precision. Walter assisted clumsily but willingly, following instructions with careful attention. The Reverend stood apart, his distaste evident, contributing nothing but occasional biblical references to man's dominion over beasts. Eleanor observed it all with growing unease. The Reverend's eyes kept straying to the cabin, to the rifle leaning against the doorframe, to the trail that led down the mountain. She could almost see the calculations running behind his pious facade, weighing options, measuring risks, considering the possibilities for escape with his ill-gotten treasures. "Walter," Blackwood said quietly as he worked, "fetch the iron pot from the cabin. We'll need it for the organ meat." It was a transparent excuse to separate them, to prevent the Reverend from being alone in the cabin where the diamonds remained hidden. But Abernathy seemed not to notice, his attention fixed on Eleanor with unsettling intensity. The moment Walter disappeared inside, the Reverend approached her. "My child," he said softly, "I sense you are troubled by more than your injury. Perhaps you wish to unburden your soul. Even without speech, you might find comfort in a spiritual confidant." Eleanor shook her head, taking an instinctive step back. Her movement caught Blackwood's attention, his hands pausing in their work as he assessed the situation. "Miss Hayes isn't much for confession, Reverend," he said, his tone deceptively casual. "Finds her own peace, I imagine." "Some burdens require proper spiritual authority to lift," the Reverend insisted, "especially those involving moral complications or dangerous knowledge." The implication hung in the air between them. Eleanor met the Reverend's gaze unflinchingly, refusing to be intimidated despite the chill that ran through her at his words. In that moment, all pretense fell away. What remained was the cold calculation of a predator, no different from the mountain lion, except that its hunger was for wealth rather than flesh. "Strange," Blackwood commented, straightening to his full height, bloody knife still in hand. "How you phrase that, Reverend. Almost as if you're concerned about what Miss Hayes might know." The Reverend's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I merely offer spiritual comfort, as is my calling." "Your calling," Blackwood repeated, his tone flat. "Like the missionary couple in Denver? Was spiritual comfort what you offered them before their throats were cut?" The words struck like a physical blow. The Reverend stiffened, his facade cracking to reveal naked shock beneath. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Abernathy lunged toward the cabin door, toward the rifle, with surprising speed for a man of his age and supposed infirmity. Blackwood moved faster. With 2 long strides, he intercepted the Reverend, driving him backward into the snow. Abernathy fought with unexpected viciousness, all pretense of spiritual dignity abandoned as he clawed and kicked. Blackwood, though stronger, was hampered by his unwillingness to use the knife still clutched in his hand, reluctant to deliver a killing blow when justice, not vengeance, was required. Eleanor acted on instinct. Snatching up a length of firewood from the nearby pile, she swung it with all her strength, catching the Reverend on the side of his head. The blow wasn't powerful enough to knock him unconscious, but it stunned him sufficiently for Blackwood to pin him face down in the snow. One knee pressed firmly between his shoulder blades, Walter emerged from the cabin, the forgotten iron pot in one hand, and froze at the tableau before him. "Dear God," he murmured. "Rope," Blackwood ordered tersely. in the storage box by the woodpile. Within minutes, the Reverend had been securely bound and marched back into the cabin. Blood trickled from a gash at his temple where Eleanor's makeshift weapon had connected, but his eyes burned with cold fury as they secured him to a chair. "You've assaulted a man of God," he spat, abandoning his earlier genteel manner. "The Lord will smite you for this sacrilege." "Funny thing about the Lord," Blackwood remarked, checking the bonds to ensure they were tight but not cutting off circulation. "In my experience, he's remarkably uninterested in protecting murderers who invoke his name." "You have no proof of these outrageous accusations," the Reverend blustered, though his eyes darted nervously to where his Bible lay on the shelf, its hidden compartment now empty of diamonds. "I suspect the authorities in Denver have proof enough," Blackwood replied, calmly. "But just to satisfy curiosity, how did Miller fit into your scheme? Partner or pawn?" A calculating look crossed the Reverend's face. "Release me, and perhaps we could come to an arrangement. Those stones are worth a small fortune, enough to make new lives for all of us, far from these God-forsaken mountains." "Not interested in blood money," Blackwood said flatly. "Answer the question." Seeing no advantage in further denial, the Reverend's expression hardened into contempt. "Miller was a necessary tool, muscle when needed, transportation expertise. 2. Greedy for his own good, questioning his share at every turn." A cold smile touched his lips. The avalanche solved that particular problem rather neatly. "And Mrs. Cunningham? Mr. Pickett? Were their deaths merely convenient accidents as well?" Walter demanded, grief and anger warring in his voice. The Reverend shrugged, the gesture macabre against his bonds. "Collateral damage in God's plan. Some must be sacrificed for the greater work." "And what greater work would justify murder?" Blackwood asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Power," the Reverend replied simply. "The diamond mine in Africa supplies funds to missionaries who then influence tribal leaders who control vast territories rich with more resources. The mission board are fools, seeing only souls to save. I see empires to build." His gaze grew distant, fervent. "With sufficient wealth properly applied, a man might shape nations from within, unseen but all-powerful." The naked ambition in his voice sent a chill through Eleanor. This was madness clothed in religious rhetoric, the same dangerous fanaticism that had fueled crusades and inquisitions throughout history. "What do we do with him?" she wrote, showing the journal to Blackwood. "Justice needs to be served," Walter insisted before Blackwood could respond. "He must answer for Martha's death, for all of them." Blackwood considered for a moment. "The snow will crust enough for travel in 2 days if this cold holds. We take him to Silverton, turn him over to the territorial marshal there. The diamonds go as evidence." The Reverend laughed, a harsh sound devoid of humor. 2 days bound to a chair? I'll be dead of exposure or circulation failure long before then. "You'll be monitored and allowed necessary movement," Blackwood replied evenly. "Basic humanity isn't a kindness, Reverend, just the difference between us and you." That night, they took watches in shifts, Walter first, then Eleanor, with Blackwood, claiming the pre-dawn hours when vigilance was most difficult to maintain. The Reverend alternated between threats, bribery attempts, and feigned sleep, testing each of his captors for weakness. During her watch, Eleanor sat across from the bound man, the mountain lion's pelt draped across her shoulders against the cabins. Nighttime chill, the Reverend studied her with clinical detachment, like a scientist observing an interesting specimen. "We're not so different, you and I," he said finally, his voice pitched low to avoid waking Walter, who slept fitfully nearby. "Both silenced by circumstance, both adapting to survive." Eleanor raised an eyebrow, unimpressed by the attempted manipulation. "You think me a monster," the Reverend continued, "but I merely recognized opportunity where others saw tragedy. The strong adapt and thrive, the weak perish. It's nature's law played out in human affairs. She considered this twisted philosophy, then wrote in her journal, "The difference is choice. My silence was forced upon me. Your crimes were choices freely made." The Reverend read her words and smiled thinly. "Choice is the luxury of the powerful. Miss Hayes, I chose power when powerlessness was my only alternative." His eyes narrowed. "Tell me, in your silent world, haven't you longed for the ability to make others listen, to command rather than request, to punish those who dismissed you?" The question struck uncomfortably close to buried feelings Eleanor rarely acknowledged. There had been moments, sitting ignored at social gatherings, watching others speak for her without permission, enduring the patronizing patience of doctors and relatives, when rage had coiled inside her like a serpent, when she had indeed fantasized about power, about forcing recognition of her worth from a world determined to define her by what she lacked. But that darkness had never translated to action. The gulf between resentful thought and murderous deed remained vast and uncrossable in her moral universe. "Thoughts are not actions," she wrote. "We are defined by choices, not impulses." "Convenient morality," the Reverend scoffed. "You stand in judgment only because you lack the courage to grasp what you desire." Eleanor shook her head, refusing to be baited further. She recognized the Reverend's strategy now to create doubt, to suggest equivalence between his calculated evil and normal human frailty. It was the oldest manipulation, dating back to Eden's serpent. The suggestion that moral boundaries were arbitrary, that power justified any action, that the ends sanctified bloody means. The remainder of her watch passed in silence. When Blackwood relieved her in the deep hours before dawn, she surrendered her position with relief, exhausted by the Reverend's psychological probing. "He tried to convert you to his philosophy?" Blackwood asked quietly as they crossed paths. Eleanor nodded, then wrote, "He believes himself a superior being above common morality, most dangerous kind of evil," Blackwood observed. "Not the man who knows he's wrong but does it anyway. The man who's convinced his every action is justified by some higher purpose only he can see." He glanced at the Reverend, who appeared to be dozing. "Get some rest. Tomorrow will test us all." As she settled onto her sleeping mat, Eleanor found herself reflecting on the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. A week ago, she had been traveling toward a carefully planned future, her path seemingly ordained by the limited options available to a woman in her circumstances. Now she lay in a mountain cabin, her arm bearing fresh scars from a predator's claws, standing guard over a murderer, her future suddenly as vast and unmapped as the wilderness outside. The irony wasn't lost on her that in the midst of danger and hardship, she had found a kind of freedom that had eluded her in civilization's supposed safety. Here, in this harsh place where survival depended on action rather than appearance, her silence had ceased to define her. Blackwood, Walter, even the mountain itself judged her by what she could do, not by the voice she lacked, as sleep claimed. Her one certainty crystallized in Eleanor's mind. Whatever came next, whether justice in Silverton or some unforeseen complication, she would not return to the passive existence she had led before. The mountains had changed her, marked her both physically and spiritually. The woman who eventually emerged from this wilderness would forge her own path, silent or not, on terms of her own making. Outside, the temperature continued to drop, ice crystals forming on the cabin's small window. The snow began to crust, hardening into a surface that might in time bear the weight of those desperate to traverse it. Nature, indifferent to human dramas, prepared the stage for whatever resolution awaited when dawn broke over the Colorado mountains. Dawn brought the promised crust on the snow, a delicate shell that crackled beneath their weight, but held firm enough for travel. Blackwood tested it methodically, venturing farther from the cabin with each pass, measuring its strength against their necessary journey. "It'll bear us to Silverton," he announced finally, returning to where Eleanor and Walter waited, the bound reverend under their watchful eyes. "We leave within the hour." Preparation was swift and practical, food parceled into small bundles for easy access during their trek, water skins filled and tucked beneath layers to prevent freezing, the precious diamonds secured in a pouch around Blackwood's neck, safely hidden beneath his clothing. The Reverend had fallen into a sullen silence after his failed attempts to manipulate them, conserving energy and watching for opportunities that had not materialized. They had taken turns guarding him through the night, allowing necessary movement to prevent injury, but permitting no chance of escape. Now, as they prepared to depart, Blackwood bound the man's hands before him, loose enough for balance on treacherous and terrain, but secure enough to prevent flight. "How will you explain this to authorities?" the Reverend asked, breaking his silence as Blackwood checked the bindings. A recluse mountain man, a mute woman, and a grief-crazed Easterner delivering a bound clergyman with wild tales of murder and stolen diamonds. "Who do you imagine they'll believe?" "Truth has a weight to it," Blackwood replied, untroubled, "and the territorial marshal in Silverton is no fool. He's been tracking the Denver murders since they happened. They departed as the morning sun gilded the mountain peaks, transforming the stark white landscape into a dazzling panorama of light and shadow. Under different circumstances, Eleanor might have found it breathtakingly beautiful. Now, she registered its magnificence with detached appreciation, her focus on the treacherous journey ahead. Blackwood led the way, breaking trail where necessary, testing suspicious surfaces with his walking stick. Walter followed, then the Reverend, with Eleanor bringing up the rear, a position that allowed her to watch their prisoner without becoming vulnerable to him. Her injured arm throbbed beneath its bandages, but the pain had receded to a manageable ache, her body already beginning the work of healing. They traveled in silence for the first hour, conserving breath in the thin mountain air, each lost in private thoughts. The only sounds were the crunch of snow beneath their feet, the occasional call of a winter bird, and the whisper of wind through pine boughs. The world seemed emptied of human presence, save for their small party, the vastness of the wilderness emphasizing their isolation. As the trail curved around a sheltered valley, Blackwood slowed his pace, allowing Eleanor to move alongside him, while Walter kept watch on the Reverend. "What will you do?" he asked without preamble. "After Silverton, after justice is served?" The question caught Eleanor by surprise. In the intensity of recent events, she had given little thought to her future beyond immediate survival. The teaching position in Durango still awaited her, she supposed, though the neatly ordered life it promised now seemed strangely confining after her experiences in the mountains. She withdrew her journal from an inner pocket, writing carefully despite the awkwardness of composing while walking. "The school in Durango expects me." It was to be my fresh start. Blackwood read her words, his expression unreadable. "And is that still what you want? A schoolroom, town life, predictable days?" Eleanor considered the question seriously. Before the avalanche, before her time in Blackwood's cabin, she would have answered unhesitatingly, yes. The teaching position represented security, respectability, independence within socially acceptable boundaries. It was the best future a mute woman alone could reasonably hope for in a world that valued her so little. But something had shifted within her during these extraordinary days. She had discovered capacities within herself that went untapped in civilized society: strength, resourcefulness, courage in the face of mortal danger. More importantly, she had experienced the freedom of being judged by her actions rather than her limitations, valued for what she could contribute rather than pitied for what she lacked. "I'm not the same woman who left Boston," she wrote finally. "That path seems insufficient now. A ghost of a smile touched Blackwood's lips. "The mountains change those who listen to them," he said, the simple statement carrying unexpected weight. "They strip away pretense, leave only what's true." The terrain steepened, requiring their full attention for a time as they navigated a tricky descent into a narrow valley. Fresh wolf tracks in the snow necessitated a change in their planned route, adding miles but avoiding potential danger. By midday, they had covered perhaps half the distance to Silverton, making better time than any of them had dared hope. During a brief rest, as they shared jerked venison and sips of water, the Reverend made his move. Walter, momentarily distracted, by adjusting his snowshoe bindings, allowed their prisoner slightly too much freedom. With the desperation of a man facing the gallows, Abernathy lunged suddenly toward Eleanor, correctly assessing her as physically weaker than Blackwood. What he failed to account for was how thoroughly she had transformed. The Eleanor of a week ago might have recoiled in fear, might have frozen in panic. This Eleanor reacted with swift, decisive movement, sidestepping his clumsy rush and using his momentum to send him sprawling face first into the snow. Blackwood was on the Reverend instantly, subduing him with efficient force. There was no triumph in his expression, only grim determination as he secured their prisoner more tightly, checking his bonds for any possibility of further escape. "You should have taken my offer," the Reverend spat, blood from a split lip staining the snow beneath him. "Gold buys forgiveness for any sin in this world." Eleanor knelt beside him, meeting his rage-filled eyes with calm certainty. She opened her journal to a blank page and wrote a single sentence: "Some silences cannot be bought." The remainder of their journey passed without further incident. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the snow, the first structures of Silverton appeared in the distance, rough-hewn buildings nestled in a protected valley, smoke rising from chimneys in grey columns against the darkening sky. Their arrival caused an immediate stir. Townsfolk emerged from homes and businesses, regarding the strange procession with undisguised curiosity. A bound man in clerical garb, a mountain recluse known to few, a clearly Eastern gentleman, and a woman bearing visible injuries. They made an unlikely party by any standard. The territorial marshal, a weathered man named Hollister with shrewd eyes and a silver-streaked beard, received them in his small office with remarkably little skepticism. The Denver murders had indeed reached his attention, complete with descriptions of the missing church diamonds and the supposedly replacement. "Missionary headed for Durango. Been expecting trouble to blow in with the winter storms," he commented, examining the diamonds Blackwood had surrendered as evidence, "though I admit didn't expect it in quite this form." The Reverend was placed in the town's small jail, his protests falling on unsympathetic ears as the marshal sent telegrams to Denver, confirming his identity and crimes. Justice would be slow but inexorable, grinding forward with the same patient inevitability as the mountains themselves. With their duty discharged, the survivors found themselves at an unexpected crossroads. Walter would continue to Durango once. The passes fully cleared, determined to reach his son and build a new life despite his grievous loss. The school board would need to be notified of Eleanor's survival and impending arrival, or her change of plans, should she choose a different path. On their last evening in Silverton, as they shared a meal in the town's small hotel, Blackwood finally asked the question that had remained unspoken between them. "The school in Durango would still welcome you," he said quietly, "or you could return east, where life might be easier for a woman alone." Eleanor considered these options, weighing them against the alternative that had been forming in her mind. Since their journey began, she wrote carefully in her journal, each word a deliberate choice. "The mountains have given me a voice I never had in so-called civilization. I would stay if there is a place for me." Blackwood read her words, something vulnerable briefly visible beneath his usual reserve. My cabin is remote, the life harsh by most standards. Winters are long, comforts few. He paused, choosing his next words with care. But there would always be a place for you, should you want it, not as a dependent, but as a partner, equal in all things. Outside, snow began to fall again, gentle flakes drifting past the window like whispered possibilities. Eleanor watched them for a long moment, contemplating the irony of finding her truest voice in silence, her greatest freedom in the wilderness that had nearly claimed her life. She turned to a fresh page in her journal, writing her answer not in the careful, proper script she had been taught in Boston finishing schools, but in bold, certain strokes that reflected the woman she had become. The silent journey continues, then, together. And in that moment of choice, in that deliberate embrace of an unconventional future, Eleanor Hayes finally and completely broke free of the constraints that had bound her far more thoroughly than any physical limitation ever could. The mountains had indeed changed her, not by giving her back what she had lost, but by showing her the strength that had always existed within her silence, waiting only for the courage to claim it. Some stories end with words. Hers would continue. Without them, written instead in the language of survival, of purpose, of a life deliberately chosen rather than reluctantly accepted, a testament to the voice that dwells within even the deepest silence. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.